Hey guys, so today I'm going to focus on dynamic range, specifically on how to best handle this concept of dynamic range in the mastering process. And I'm also going to talk about size, I'm going to talk about level, I'm going to talk about all these things that we take into account when dealing with how to best realize a mix in its finished form, which is what we do in mastering. So every project is different. And when you're dealing with dynamic range, you really have to zero in on what you're working on. What is the song at hand? What is the mix at hand that you have? And what do you need to do to best utilize your processes to achieve the maximum result? And this track in particular will be great to use as an example for how to get around something that has a lot of wide dynamic range, that has a natural build to it over time, but also has an ebb and flow, and you'll see. So let's just listen to this flat and get an idea of what this is. I'm going to take it from this end section and just focus in on this final big build of it. All right, so this is just a powerful song. You know, it's a powerful mix, and it's got all this bottom energy, and it just continues to build and build, and it's also got these big builds, and then they kind of swell back, and then they come back again. So you want to make sure as they come back again and reach you, they reach at maximum, at their maximum potential. You don't want to have a situation where you're trying to push it too far, and then it's reaching, and then it hits a brick wall at the end, digital ceiling, and it feels like it stops and doesn't fully extend. That would be pushing something too far dynamically. And also, you don't want to feel limp and not fully realize. You don't want to feel like it's not fully coming and connecting to you, and it feels like it's kind of further away in the speakers and not really reaching you and taking up the full space that it can. So that's just talking dynamic range for the sake of understanding the dynamic content of it, not talking about EQ. EQ-wise, it feels like it's not fully open and expanded. It feels like it's kind of dark and brooding. There's a whole lot of bottom. There's kind of like a ball of bottom, probably somewhere around 40 to 50 hertz, that I want to use as a nice rooted support that I can then open up on top. There's a few ways you could tackle that type of thing. You could broadly just EQ it. You could filter some of the bottom out, which might be something worth exploring. Or you could shelve open some high frequency, maybe around 12K, 8K, maybe right at 10K. My gut is telling me it might be cool to put a shelf EQ and add maybe a half dB at around 10K. That'll open up the top and it'll allow me to not have to work this EQ on the board as much. Another way to do it, as I said, would be to filter out some of the low, and you could end up in a similar place. But my gut is telling me to start with the shelf. So I'm going to add that, and I'm going to use George Massenburg's EQ, which I love because it's a very transparent EQ. And here we are. You can find this in the UA suite, or you can buy it as a standalone. And I'm just going to try 10K at, let's try 4/10. And I'm going to EQ around this now. So that's good. As I'm listening to it build, I want to make sure that it fully expands at the very, very end. If I go too far, you're going to get that point where it feels like it's not quite reaching you because it's getting jammed up against that limiter and that brick wall, and it's not fully extended. So I'm EQing, and I'm also playing with the gain into the EQ and into all the processes just to fine tune everything, make sure everything has all the space that it needs, but just the right amount of space so it takes up the proper amount of space to feel fully expanded, not too little and not too much. So let me fine tune this a little bit more. Now, just to show you, I could play around with this shelf EQ a little bit further, but just to show you what this is doing, I'm going to hit bypass, and you'll see how wrong it sounds. And it's not that it needs that particular EQ. That particular EQ is there as one of the puzzle pieces that's in all of my puzzle pieces, all weave together to create this nice balance in the end. My EQ choices on the board are being influenced by this initial EQ. In other words, if I put this in bypass, you'll see the whole thing falls apart because none of these decisions were based off it in bypass, they were based off it active. So you can hear the difference now. I'm just going to flip between bypass and not. This is bypass. Great. So when it was in bypass, it's almost like the bottom took over because it had the absence of that open top, right? So all of a sudden, all that bottom was hitting into the converter, crunching up the converter. It doesn't feel like it's fully expanded. The overall picture feels smaller. But when I hit that 4/10 just on 10K, everything expands open. The bottom's not hitting the converter as hard because there's not as much relative bottom there. There's more relative top. So the angle of which it's hitting the converter is different, keeping it nice and open and expanded. And I'm just peppering it here with some additional EQ to kind of bring everything into a better balance. And I can bypass that in and out too so you can hear what that's doing. And just for fun, I'm going to do both at the same time. Both the shelf EQ and the tube EQ all together so you can hear the total EQ. And you know what? I'll even do this EQ too, the solid state, which is just doing a little bit of bottom shaping. Everything is all working together, and I'll do one big before and after. Just on the EQ, not even taking into account all of the dynamic processing that's happening post the EQ stage in our process here. So you can fine tune this even further. You could try experimenting with backing it off a little bit into this, fine tuning the EQ based off that, because if you back it off, you might find that you have less hold on the bottom just based off how everything's working. If you push it a little further, you might find that you need to EQ it even further open. So these are the things to key in on. You're within the window of you can leaning a little bit this way and a little bit that way where it's all going to be good as long as you finalize your balance with EQ. You could back it off, you could push a little bit more, you EQ to make those decisions work, and you're always going to find yourself in a place of where it feels really good. And what to key in on is where it feels best to you. Where does it fully expand? Where is the biggest picture you can draw? In this particular case, the music calls for it. You want to go with this big, brooding, impactful, intense build that just makes the hairs on your arms stand up. That's what you're going for in this particular case. That's what the client wants. That's what the film wants if this gets into a film or a trailer, wherever this ends up. That's the reaction that we're shooting for, so that's what we're trying to achieve.